Welcome back with a smiling face. Important note before starting, if you are a fan of audio stories, then our Patreon account is the best platform for you. Join us on Patreon for the best audiobooks ever. No End to Days. Episode 3. Chapter 10. You realize we're partners, right? That you have to help me because you're required, Tony said. It was right after class and Tony jumped and skipped up the pathway back toward Seeker. And you're still supposed to teach me how to drive, I reminded him. Speaking of that, he said, I need you to sit for me. For your portrait. This was supposed to be a trade. Come on. An hour. You don't have to work till 4, he pleaded. I have to go get my wallet. Come see famous Professor Bennett's dorm apartment. Lunch, then portrait. Nice. Tony said. I took out my hat and sunglasses, and we started to walk. I wonder if his ghost is in there. The early morning sun was just starting to beat down on Wickham campus when Tony and I stepped into Seeker Hall. He showed his ID to the security guard, we headed for the stairs, and started climbing. You know they have elevators. They go up and down just by the push of a button. Kind of amazing, Tony said between labored breaths as we climbed toward the 5th floor. Never been in an elevator. What? You are one weird chick, Lena. Was I acting as I should? Perhaps I did step over the line with the cat during anatomy class. Tony continued to follow me up the stairs. I still cannot believe you not only ripped a cat open no problem, but you're not freaked out to live in Bennett's old place. Guy was a real nice teacher, don't get me wrong. But, seriously, Len, that's creepy. I stopped in front of my door and slid the key in the lock. Doesn't bother me, I replied. A guy died in there, he said as we stood outside the door. Before I pushed it open, Tony leaned forward and sniffed the rosemary I had nailed to the door. I don't know about you, but I believe in ghosts, spirits, all that. And everyone says Bennett was murdered. The school administration probably wouldn't let me live here if that were true. Besides, people die in lots of places, I said. What are the flowers for? It's rosemary, I said, opening the door and stepping inside. I placed my sunglasses and hat on the black lacquered foyer table, which sat to the right of the front door. It's a flower you put on your door to protect you. To remind you to stay safe. Safe from what? Tony asked as I shut the door behind us. Whoa! This is so cool. My roommate smells like crap and you live here. Tony ran a hand on the soft couch and jumped in his step from painting to painting on the wall. Rhodes' long sword was of particular interest. Tony walked right up and stood in front of it. What does Ida Fert cord voluntas mean? Tony asked, sounding out the Latin words inscribed on Rhodes' sword. He ran his fingers down the middle of the blade with his index finger. Be careful, I said. Don't touch the edge or it will cut you. Tony placed his hands back by his sides. It means, the heart wills it. So this is real? What era is it from? Who gave it to you? I didn't say anything. Instead, I walked away and looked for my wallet in my bedroom. This looks so real, I heard Tony say again. His eyes were inches from the blade. I walked into my bedroom and found the wallet resting on my night table. When I came back into the living room, Tony had left the sword and was standing over the Order of the Garter book, looking down at the engraving of Road. He was so close to the bureau. My photos. My eyes snapped back and forth from the photos on the bureau and Tony's back. My mouth was suddenly dry parched. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. Tony was silent, his back remained to me. "Are ready?" I croaked. "Is there any subject you don't like?" Tony asked, and turned to me. "You're a history geek, too." I sighed with a smile. He hadn't noticed the photographs. "Let's go," I said. "I'm starving." "Okay, Lena." "Turn the car on," Tony coaxed. That Saturday, Tony and I sat in the Seeker parking lot. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles turned white and sweat formed under my palms. The keys dangled from the ignition. I turned it, and the engine purred to life. Tony explained the workings of the gas and brake pedal, turn signals, and the importance of reverse. It was very interesting and not unlike the commands my father had taught me in the 15th century when I watched him maneuver the cows and horses in the orchard. The 1400s in England were marred by the end of the plague. There was less man labor because of all the deaths, and my father refused to let me out of his sight. My disappearance must have killed him. I never found out what happened to my family. After an hour or so, I eased the car into a parking spot that faced Seeker and turned the car off. We rolled down the windows, and I stuck my feet out so they rested on the frame. "Do all people sunbathe?" I asked, happy to be under the shade of a nearby tree. I looked at Tony through the shadow of my sunglasses. "You don't like the sun, do you?" Tony asked. He had reclined his seat all the way back. "I don't like things that make me uncomfortable," I replied. "Well, Justin Enos pretty much makes everyone uncomfortable. Kinda why I stay away from him and all the soccer freaks, lacrosse junkies, and football nuts. Kinda why I hate you for making me come." "I've met worse," I said with a laugh. There was silence between us for a moment. I looked down at my clothes, hoping what I wore wasn't another giveaway that I was anything less than normal. I wore black shorts over a black one-piece that Tony insisted I buy. He came with me to the store and it took 10 minutes to shut him up about buying a thong bikini. Even though Tony was wearing his swim trunks, he was still, well, Tony. He wore silver rings with crossbones and dragons. His swim trunks were black with flames rising all over them. "What is that?" Tony asked, sitting up and looking down at my chest. I followed his gaze. Before I had time to wonder if he was looking at my breasts, I realized he was looking at the vial necklace. In it, Rhodes' remains. They were ash and gold and sparkled in the light glinting through the windshield. I held the small pendant, which was crystal, shaped with a small silver stop. It looked like a clear dagger. I took a breath, rolling the vial between my thumb and index finger. "If I tell you, promise not to tell anyone." "Yet," Tony said, though his tone was a bit more excited than I would have liked. "A friend of mine died. And these are some of his remains." Tony's smile faded as though I slapped it off him. He sat up and leaned toward me, like he was going to inspect the vial. He stopped. "Can I?" he asked. He had leaned his body closer, his eyes looking straight at my chest. "Sure," I said, almost in a whisper, and held the vial in my palm, though I left it around my neck. Tony placed it so close to his eyes I could see the minute embers of light dance in the black pupils of his brown eyes. "Should it be sparkling like this?" he asked, taking a quick glance at me. "Yes," I whispered, and sat back in the seat so the vial fell onto my chest. I also wished I wasn't wearing the onyx ring. I hoped he wasn't so observant. Through the window I could hear happy voices and the sound of passing cars out on Main Street. When I looked up, I could see the lines in the leaves and the fibers of the bark of the trees. I could distract myself with driving lessons and friends. Road was still dead, and his beautiful ashes were all I had to prove it. "I had a brother who died," Tony said unexpectedly. His sympathetic gaze surprised me. He sat back in his seat. "When?" I asked, suddenly hearing a thump of a bass from a car stereo. It was far away, but I could hear it nonetheless. "When I was 10. One day he was alive, and the next dead." "Car accident?" I nodded. Not exactly sure how I could respond to that. Kind of why I can't always go along with everyone's happy attitude all the time. Life sucks sometimes, and most people don't get it. They think, well, all of the people at this school, anyway, they think everything is just handed to them. Real easy, you know? Like, the day is never something you have to fight through. I placed my hand on top of Tony's and let it rest there for a moment. What could I say? I was a death giver. Happy to do it. I had been so good at being dead. I used to think I could talk to my brother after he died. When I was a kid, I lay in bed and whispered to him. Told him all my problems. Sometimes I dreamt about him right after, when I fell asleep. Do you think it's possible he was talking back to me? The dewiness of Tony's skin and the innocence behind his eyes made me want to lie. But I had seen death. Really seen it. And when someone died, they were gone for the rest of time. Like you said the other day. Anything's possible, I replied. Boom boom boom. A bass thumped from a car stereo somewhere on Main Street. I turned and looked behind us just as Justin's SUV came through the Wickham gates and pulled into the spot next to mine. Justin rolled down the window. "You guys ready?" he asked. I glanced at Tony, whose eyes said that we had reached a new understanding of each other. Were we ready? I think we were. Chapter 11. I wish I could tell you that I sat in bright sunlight on the bow of the boat with my feet dangling over the edge. I wish I could say that I watched the spray shoot up from beneath Justin's luxury motorboat and that the cold drops tickled the bottoms of my feet. No. From the moment we backed out of the boat slip, I was hidden away in the cushy cabin. This boat was not the same as Justin's racing boat. This was Justin's father's boat, used only for lounge riding and, in our case, for snorkeling. A set of stairs led down from the boat deck into a hallway. I remembered small cabins and cottages from my human life, but this boat interior was amazing. It was meant to float. On either side of the hallway were two booths, a kitchen, and a bathroom. I walked toward an open door leading to a bedroom. I sat on the bed and folded my clothes so they were neatly piled in my bag, along with my necklace of Rhodes remains. I tucked that at the bottom, safe from prying eyes. I slid a white tube of sunblock out of my backpack. Black bold letters read, SPF 50. I looked down the long hallway again. The sun's rays cast gleams of light onto the steps that led up to the main deck of the boat. I sighed, flipped open the cap, and squeezed the tube just a little too hard. The creamy substance spilled all over my hands, so it oozed between my fingers and dripped onto the carpeted floor. The white liquid contrasted sharply with the royal blue stitching of the soft carpeting, and I tried to rub the suntan lotion into the carpet with my big toe. To make matters worse, the motors slowed above and I knew we were coming close to the snorkeling spot. Soon people would come downstairs and see that I had rubbed a palm's worth of lotion all over my pale thighs. I stood up and furiously rubbed my calves, my ears, my arms. I was starting to sweat. If I missed a spot, would it be like before? Would I burn easily? Maybe the transformation needed a few more days. The lotion smeared everywhere. It wouldn't rub in. Are you ever coming up from down there? You have to actually go into the water if you want to snorkel, Tony called down to me. Tony came down a few steps, so he was standing in the boat stairwell. I rubbed the suntan lotion onto my feet. He laughed, his smile sweet. You have that stuff all over your face, he said. He walked forward and rubbed the tip of my nose and the creases on each side of my nostrils with his index finger. He smelled like coconut, just like the lotion I was rubbing all over, and he smoothed it in so it melted into my skin. This was your great idea, he said, and sat down on the bed, crossing one ankle over the other. He wasn't wearing a shirt, so I couldn't help but look over his physique. He wasn't sculpted like Justin, but he was stocky and in shape. I sat back down on the bed but kept my back upright. My fingers clasped the 50 SPF sunblock. Are you all right? Tony asked, sitting up and looking at me. I nodded but remained silent. Tony pushed his sunglasses to the top of his head and tried to meet my eyes, but they were hidden behind my sunglasses. Have you ever been on a boat before? Long time ago, I barely whispered. Are you freaking out on me right now? I nodded again, once, and swallowed. My mouth was very, very dry. Hadn't I brought some water with me? Where was it? Tony turned me by my shoulder, so I faced him. Lena. We're going, 3 miles away from the beach. It's totally fine. Nothing bad's going to happen on the boat. I lifted the sunblock. Will you put this on my back? I asked. I didn't mention to Tony that it wasn't the boat or the ocean beneath us. It was the sun, the blaring sun, and what it could do to my rejuvenated body only a few days old. I heard the motors slowing once more, and the roaring zoom was now a quiet purr. As I mentioned, the bathing suit I bought was black, very low cut in the front, and had very high cutouts in the hip. The vampire life is not tainted by body issues and fat. We are what we eat, if you will. I was a purist and was relentless in my pursuit of perfect blood. The outside of my body was a true reflection of the purest blood I could possibly find. Tony's index finger was calloused. I knew this was because of all his painting and sketching. His footsteps were different on the boat, too. Without the lumbering specificity of the different boots, he was just a clumsy teenager to me. He rubbed the lotion over my back with his rough palms, but I didn't say anything. He was the first person to touch my skin. He continued to rub the lotion over my back in wide circles. My tattoo was exposed, and I noticed he spent a few more circular motions than usual on my left shoulder. I knew he was reading and rereading it, wondering when I would explain what it meant. The motors stopped completely at the same time as Tony said, "So, what does evil be he?" "Thanks," I said, interrupting him and spinning around. I took the sunblock out of his hand and tossed it onto the top of my bag. "Come on." I heard Roy Enos call, and then a moment later a hefty splash of water. I stepped up and out of the cabin. There were 2 double engines and a few seats on either side of the boat. Tracy stood on top of the rim of the boat and jumped into the water. She was wearing a red 2-piece, which was tied together over her hip bones by 2 tiny strings. I suddenly hated my bathing suit and wished I had bought a bikini instead. The other members of the 3-piece, Claudia and Kate, were already in the ocean. Tony had climbed over a ladder and was doing the breaststroke out to the others. After Justin had dropped an anchor into the water, he readied the snorkeling equipment. He turned around with a red plastic mask hanging from his right hand. "Wow," he said, and his eyebrows raised. His eyes traveled up and down my body, and I tried my hardest not to pose. Justin turned away rather quickly. He fiddled with clear masks, blow tubes, flippers that looked like those in fish tanks I had seen in museums at the beginning of the century. Justin laid them out on top of a small cooler. His feet were strong, they held his frame well, and they were tanned from the sun. Roy Enos, who had a smaller head and a slimmer face than Justin, was treading water. He called to his brother back on the boat. "Throw me those flippers, Justin," he said, and rolled onto his back so he was floating. I looked down over the boat and realized that there wasn't much of an ocean below us at all. We were in a harbor, and when the trees swayed in the wind I could see some of the familiar red brick buildings of Wickham. The harbor was like an alcove just parallel to Wickham Beach. I could specify beads of sand and blades of grass. But I tried to forget about my vampire sight, so I focused back down on the water. Most of the girls were standing on their tiptoes. Tony was doing a handstand next to Tracy. Claudia, the smallest of the 3-piece, swam around the boat wearing a snorkel mask. She peered down into the 5 or 6 feet that was directly below. "Ah, yes," I thought. Snorkeling in action. "You know you have to jump in that wet stuff, right?" Justin asked. "I know," I said casually, and came out from underneath the protection of the awning over the driver's seat. The sun washed over my back and shoulders when I leaned forward to peer back at the water. Tracy arched her back and bent backward, dipping her hair into the water. Wasn't I supposed to be the beautiful one here? I felt my stomach tighten. Instinctively, I placed my palms over my belly button. I was still surprised my body reacted this way. That the muscles would link to my emotions. Usually, this is fun. "I didn't know you were afraid of boats," Justin said, and lifted his right foot in order to prepare to step up and stand on the edge of the boat. "I'm not afraid of boats," I said, and dropped my hands. "Sure, you're not," he said, smiling in a devilish, challenging way. Before I could even begin to defend myself, Justin stepped up onto the rim of the boat. I watched his knees bend and the bottom of his feet press onto the wooden rim. He pushed up high off the boat. Before he hit the water he flipped so he did a somersault in the air, and then splashed into the water so the spray came up high over my head. What on earth could be the point in that? Those in the water laughed and clapped. Seemed a bit useless to jump for sheer amusement. "My turn," said Roy, and he swam back toward the boat. "Don't crack your head," Justin said to Roy. "Be careful." Much to my surprise, one by one they all somersaulted off the boat. Why didn't I want to jump? Other people seemed to find such happiness in it. I turned away from the acrobatics and walked up to the bow. I sat down with my feet dangling over the edge. Behind me, there were more happy yelps and splashes, but I focused on the small waves slapping against the boat's underbelly. Even though I was wearing my floppy hat, I could still feel the sun shining down on me, heating me up. I glanced back to see Roy and then Justin somersault, in perfect circular movements off the boat. He was something, wasn't he? To be able to do that and in the bright of day. Girvan, Scotland. 1850. I lay in a field hidden behind a series of houses. I always dressed in the most luxurious fabrics. That night's dress was black and ankle-length, made from China silk, with a corset brocaded with flowers of red, green, and purple. The iridescent satin gathered on each side and created a tier of ruffles. I wore my hair long, in a braid. It was just after 9 p.m. and the houses on the street ahead of me oozed a dreamy light from their small windows. Girvan, Scotland, was a coastal town. A close-knit community with sweeping, endless hills. We, the coven, were in a meadow behind a stone wall that ran parallel to the main street. Song was pacing, keeping watch as always. Heath lay on his back, watching the stars move through the sky. Gavin threw tiny knives into the bark of a tree. He always held a collection of daggers in his boots or pockets. On that night, he picked a tree about 100 yards away, threw the knife, and then retrieved it to do it all over again. "We need someone knowledgeable," I said. I stood up from the grassy ground next to Heath and started to pace. I was ruminating again. 5 is a strong coven. After all, there are 5 points on the pentacle star. North. I pointed at Heath. East. I pointed at Song. And south. I pointed at Gavin. We need a west. We are missing our west. 4 protectors with me, the crux, the center. With 5 members, the pentacle would be complete. Once the coven was fulfilled, the bonds between us would be unbreakable. The magic would require the coven to remain ruthlessly committed to one another until their deaths. All 3 of them, Gavin, Heath, and Song, knew I wanted one more to join our unit. Though, I think Gavin, the more careful of us, feared the power of the magic. Binding magic is lethal. It creates an invisible bond that ties to your soul. Breaking the bond is impossible. It means death. This was exactly my intention when making the coven. No one would betray me unless they wanted me to kill them. If I made the right choice and made the right man a vampire, we would be unbeatable. I wanted to ensure that we never had to worry about our survival. Survival? Could I even call it that? Above us is Andromeda, Heath said, only in Latin. He was my second vampire, after Gavin. Next to her is Pegasus, Heath continued, and pointed up at the many stars linked together to form the mythological winged horse. "Take me, Pegasus," I called out, and started to spin in a circle, my arms out to my sides. "Take me high in the sky at noon so the sun can shine down onto my back. Let me rain on your wings." I laughed so my voice echoed through the meadow. I kept spinning and spinning until finally I collapsed down onto the ground next to Heath. He rolled onto his left hip and faced me. "They say that Andromeda appears as a woman holding a sword," he said, and ran his hand along my body from shoulder to thigh. I smiled and then rolled onto my back. I could not see Andromeda. To me, stars were tiny bright lights that I could not wield. Also, you can only see her by the 5 brightest stars in the galaxy. Interspersed in the silence, there was a thunk every time one of Gavin's knives hit his target. Song paced and paced, almost growling under his breath. We had no need to feed as we had decimated a boarding house the previous night. It would only be a few days before the power of the blood waned and we would have to feed again. As Heath continued to name the stars individually, I got up out of boredom and paced again. That's when I heard a man singing a lively Scottish song. Straight ahead through the trees was a one-story tavern made from stone. Small, rectangular windows threw candlelight toward the meadow. It had been fairly quiet, but as I walked through the trees in the direction of the tavern, the singing grew louder. Soon the voice was clear. It was gravelly but carrying the whole tavern in song. "Here's to the sodger who bled, and the sailor who bravely did fa." I held the hem of my gown so I could walk with ease over roots and branches that stuck up from the mossy ground. I knew my coven was watching me, but my extrasensory perception told me that they were at ease. "Their fame is alive, though their spirits are fled. On the wings o' the year that's awa," sang the man again. The singing voice was quite good despite the slurring of his words. I threw one leg over the stone wall and stepped down on the other side. I was a few feet away from the tavern and I approached the window as silently as possible. The candle light from inside was a glowing orange. There were wooden tables with bar stools. Men and women held glasses filled with ale or whiskey. I peeked from the right-hand corner of the window and saw a tall man, in full British military uniform, dancing on top of a table. He couldn't have been older than 18 or 19, though there were wrinkles on the sides of his eyes when he smiled. His arm muscles pushed out and gripped the cloth of his uniform. I wanted to run my hand down the line of his spine. The uniform had a red jacket and black pants. He kicked out and jumped. He took a blue felt cap and threw it into the crowd. He kicked his right leg, then his left, and jumped up and down so his feet slammed onto the tabletop while he danced a traditional Scottish step. He brought his knees up and down and repeatedly kicked his legs. The cuffs and collar of the uniform were gold. The circular buttons glinted in the torches circling the tavern. I turned. The music came from a group of men hitting drums and playing bagpipes in the back of the room. The soldier kept dancing on top of the table while the guests in the tavern clapped in time to the music. His face was red, filled with life, filled with blood. He was tall, like road, with slim features and a pouted mouth. His hands were strong, and the right one grasped the handle of a mug of ale. Their fame is alive, though their spirits are fled. On the wings o' the year that's awa. After the final resonating note he jumped from the top of the table to the ground, so his beer sloshed out of the mug and onto the wooden floor. He had brown eyes that, even from the darkness of the pub, glimmered at the tavern guests. I walked away from the window and around the perimeter of the building. I was going to go inside and talk to this man. Except, right before I pulled on the door, it banged open and hit the side of the building with a shudder. I raced across the street and leaned against a tree across from the tavern door. The trees were green and leafy, but skinny. Their tops bent toward the sky in a thin point. The man walked outside, took a deep breath, and placed a cigarette between his lips. The man inhaled, and when he exhaled the smoke into the sky, he held the cigarette in the corner of his mouth. He squinted one eye and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He took the cigarette out of his mouth, squinted his eyes at me, and took a step forward. "Is someone there?" he asked. He had a husky voice with a deep Scottish accent. I took a step away from the tree. "Hello, soldier," I said. His eyebrows rose, and he bowed in an exaggerated motion. When I did not curtsy in return, he smiled, but with curious eyes. I stepped across the dirt street and stood in front of the tavern door. "I shake hands," I said in response to his bow, and stuck my right hand out as I had seen hundreds of men do in my time. Men in society during the 1850s did not think it proper for a woman to shake hands as an equal. This is a fact that remains preposterous to me. He looked down at my outstretched palm and then up at my eyes. I was smiling with both lips closed. This was always effective whenever I wasn't getting what I wanted. "Shake hands?" I asked. He outstretched his arm, and when he did, I looked at his inner right wrist. Thin blue veins protruded from the skin and ran away from his palm and up his arm. We grasped hands, and he looked me up and down. In that moment, I wished I could have felt the touch of his strong hands. I could sense his firm grip, but no skin-to-skin contact. Nothing definitive, anyway. He let go first and backed away slowly into the tavern doorway. While I could certainly feel the heat of his stare, I would have loved to know what his fingertips felt like running down my skin. Or what his breath smelled like, or his hair. Even though I knew all of that was impossible, I wished it, anyway. All I could smell was upturned earth and musk, the scent of his flesh still lingering on my clothes. "Your hands are cold," he said. "There is something special about you," I replied, walking closer so that the light from a torch on the door illuminated my face. He came closer again. He squinted a bit, turned his head to exhale smoke, and then examined my face again, his eyes stopping on my mouth. "No, my dear. There is something special about you." This young man was looking at me with deep interest. The jovial tone was gone. "What are you?" he whispered. I admit this threw me. No one yet had mentioned my appearance, my smooth skin and wide, black pupils. No one dared admit that I was something other than normal. Most humans were transfixed by my beauty. "No one of consequence," I said casually, and started to circle him, swaying my hips in my usual way and looking him up and down. "I'm a Scots Fusilier. A man of maps. I have travelled the world to verify the locations of the Earth for the British Army. I have looked upon many faces. Noses, eyes, all of intricate specificity. Your features, lassie, are not of these parts. Nor any that you have ever known," I said, stopping my circling so that I stood in front of him. What is your name? Vicken, dear. He stepped closer. The gruff edge to his voice was so strong, much harder than Rhodes, whose gentle cadence was burned into my brain. Vicken Clough, of the 21st Regiment. Vicken held my gaze. He didn't flinch, he just blinked, calmly. Either my ESP was extraordinarily off or this man was not afraid of me. I had to leave. This was something I couldn't fathom or understand. My eyes flickered to the meadow beyond the tavern. I must go, I said, and walked past him, away from the tree and back in the direction of my coven. He grasped my forearm. I beg you not to trifle with me, miss, for you may get exactly what you want. This man was powerful, forthcoming. He knew exactly what he wanted. I ripped my arm away and headed back into the meadow. I stepped over the stone wall and toward the coven, whom I could see were still in their same spots, relaxing far off in the middle of the field. If I brought this man into the meadow, he would be instantly murdered. Not that I was against this, but I was too intrigued to have him killed just yet. Wait! I heard him call. His footsteps stopped at the edge of the meadow. Who are you? By the time Vicken had reached the field, I had moved too far into the darkness for him to see me. I stood on the side of the meadow protected by the shade of tree branches. Vicken gripped the stone wall, lifted a foot, and then placed it back on the ground. He craned his neck to see into the darkness. He swore under his breath and turned away. I walked back toward the coven. Who was that? Song asked. I couldn't help a smile of satisfaction. One of interest, I said, and peeked back over my shoulder. Vicken was walking back toward the tavern. Meet me at the inn at dawn. I looked up at the sky and the position of the moon. We have 4 hours. With that, I turned from the coven and without him knowing it, I followed Vicken home. Vicken did not live far away from the tavern. I climbed back over the wall, making sure to stay in the shadows and trail behind. When I got to the road, he was only a few yards ahead. He swerved a bit from the amount of ale he had consumed. He lived 7 houses away from the tavern. He bumped his shoulder on a tree when he turned down a small dirt road. As I followed after, I looked ahead. The drive to his home ended with a sharp cliff and then miles of ocean. Vicken's home was set on the edge of a dense forest that abutted the sea. There was a main manor made of white stone. It was 2 stories and capped by a black roof. Behind it was a smaller, 1-room cottage made of a grey stone. It was considerably less grand than the main manor. As I silently followed, I passed a horse stable where I could hear horses neighing comfortably and the sound of the ocean hitting the rocks somewhere over the cliffs. Vicken walked into the cottage and shut the door behind him. I turned the handle and followed after. It was true what he said. He loved maps, and they were everywhere. At least a dozen were on the walls and on a small wooden desk in the right-hand corner of the room. In a closet were military uniforms. Even a bright blue globe sat on the desk. The back door to the 1-room cottage was open, and in the backyard I saw Vicken setting up a contraption made of brass. It was based on 3 legs, a modern-day equivalent of a tripod. I walked past a washtub. The curtain was pulled open, and a pair of white socks hung over the basin. I stepped into the doorway, and Vicken looked up. He didn't smile or frown, he simply stared for a moment and then went back to assembling the machine. You have no fear of beasts? Monsters? I asked. You are no beast, he said matter-of-factly, and continued to fiddle with a long tube that was positioned toward the sky. He looked in the lens, checked the direction of the tube, and then looked at me again. I am more afraid, miss, of the things that I cannot see with my eyes. Vicken gestured with a wave of his hand that I join him. I walked toward the telescope and looked in the lens. The moon was crisp and clear, though the moon's cracks and crevices were another land to me. Beautiful, I barely whispered. I looked up into Vicken's eyes. He smiled a bit. I backed away in the direction of the main house. Why aren't you afraid of me? I asked. Although Vicken claimed that he was not riddled with fear, he kept his distance. He kept his fingers on the telescope, busying his nervous energy with the parts of the machine that needed to work to see the night sky. I followed the strong frame of his wide shoulders. Kept my focus on his dangerous glance. His masculinity was intoxicating. You intrigue me, he said, meeting my eyes again. I threw my head back and laughed deeply so my voice echoed in the silence. Intrigue you? Is that what this is? Curiosity. Vicken kept his gaze on the telescope. Tell me, Vicken Clough, of the 21st Regiment. What would you say if I told you you could search this earth and record it all? Be the most powerful navigator the world has ever known? That as long as the earth existed, you would exist. Vicken's slim nose and square chin pointed at the ground. His eyebrows were furrowed and kept both his hands loosely behind his back. Eternity, miss, is not possible. And if I told you it was? He looked deep in my eyes, and I waited for him to break our stare, but he stayed firm. I would believe you. I walked a few steps and stood across from him so our faces were inches apart. What do I have to do? He asked. To stay with you. He wanted to kiss me. I could see it in his eyes, that longing that brown eyes sometimes get. His lashes curled out from his lids, so when he blinked, he looked like a little boy. I smiled, this was my favorite part. He would surely feel terror after this. I let his lips brush over mine so gently that it barely registered even to me that we had touched. My fangs came down ever so slowly and I whispered, I'm going to have to kill you. Vicken's breath shuddered, and he stepped away from me. There was a twinge of fear running through him but not the kind of horror I expected. No desire to run. The only fear he felt was for his own actions, what he could or would do for me. This was mind-boggling. Preposterous. I checked the moon. 3 hours until dawn. I'll give you a night to think about it, I said, stepping around the house and heading away from Vicken and back in the direction of the main street. This time tomorrow I will come for your answer. The way you speak tells me no matter what I say, this isn't a choice. Vicken had stepped out from behind the cottage to see me. Under the smooth light of the moon, I could see the sweat on his forehead. I turned back. Why do you even consider this? I asked, sure that there must be a reason for his compliance to my wishes. Vicken's smile was crooked, so only the left half of his mouth raised. He leaned a hand on the side of the little cottage. You, he said. There was a moment of silence. I looked over his strong arms and how his hair fell about his face in a lazy, haphazard way. Say your goodbyes, then, I said, and turned away from him, disappearing into the darkness. That next night, I approached the main manor. Through the window, I saw Viken eating dinner with his family. Long white candles decorated both ends of the table. There was an open animal carcass and various bowls of greens. Viken's father sat at the head of the table, and Viken was seated directly to his right. His father, a great round man with thickets of white hair, laughed heartily and took Viken's cheek into the palm of his right hand. The familiar anguish rose in my throat. I hated families. So often this sadness made me enraged enough to murder, so I would kill whoever could possibly remind me that my family was the life that I left behind. Why didn't I want to kill this man? Why did I want to leave him in the confines of his house with his mother and father and collection of maps? Had I dared to find another that I loved besides Rode? Yes, he would be free, I decided. As I turned from the window to rejoin my coven at the inn, I caught Viken's eye. He shot up from the table and ran after me, but I hurried down the dirt pathway, away from the ocean and back toward the main road. Wait. I changed my mind. You're free, I said, turning to him in the middle of the path. On either side of me were tall trees. Do you know, you were right? You're the first man I've ever allowed a choice. Go back inside with your family. Viken walked up to me so fast I was surprised for the moment that he was only human. He placed his hands on my cheeks. I don't want that, he said so passionately that he was gritting his teeth. I've let them go. I don't want to be here, die here, and see nothing else of the world. What is it, then? What do you want? I asked. Viken grasped me by the shoulders so passionately, I didn't move. He took a deep breath. You, he said, almost panting. Just you. I looked deep into his eyes and saw such a need in his gaze. He needed me. I looked down at the strong muscles of his neck and shoulders and then back up to his eyes. He leaned forward, lightly grazing his lips over mine. I took a deep breath just so I could smell his flesh. There was that smell again, musk and salt. Soon it would run through me. It is done, I said, opening my eyes. I grasped onto his wrist and led him away from the manor. You will be joining the ranks of vampires so ancient in history that no one knows of our origins. But you will be powerful. Beyond your imagination. I walked toward the woods beyond the small cottage. Will you be there? He asked. I took his hand into mine. Always. Perhaps Viken fell in love with me because of my vampire presence. I don't know. I'll never know. Rode once told me that the aura of a vampire is so powerful that most men were disillusioned without knowing it. I can assure you that when I took him into the woods behind his cottage, he was holding my hand. And when I bit into his neck, he was looking up at the stars. Chapter 12. Lena. I shook my head, and my eyes refocused on the water lapping against the bottom of Justin's boat. Over here. I looked to the left. Justin Enos bobbed up and down as he treaded water. The sunlight reflected off the smooth surface and into his eyes, so he squinted a bit, but he was smiling. Don't make me come up there and get you, he said. As he said this, Tony floated by on an inflatable raft and snapped pictures of me. Who brought the paparazzi? Claudia asked. She was doing laps around the boat. I stood up carefully and stepped back toward the body of the boat. I tried to shake the images of Vicken from my mind, but that invisible clock, the one echoing in my head, reminded me that the days leading to Newt Rouge were near. Soon, Vicken would try to dig me up from the ground. Justin swam toward the ladder, and by the time I got there he was climbing up to join me. I've never seen the sun shine on the ocean like that before, I admitted once Justin had climbed back aboard. He was dripping from head to toe. I've never seen someone as pale as you before, Roy said from the water. Shut up, Roy, Justin spat over the laughter of the others. Roy called him a swear word I'd never heard before and swam away. Tracy was staring and so were the other girls in three-piece, though they were trying to hide it by splashing one another. There was a calm satisfaction in my mind. I remembered, gratitude. Justin had defended me. Come on, he said, and extended a hand. Before I took it, I looked at his palm. His fingers were so smooth. Some vampires, though not all, believe in palmistry. Justin's lifeline, which is the line on the palm that runs between the thumb and index finger, was very long. It almost ran down to his wrist. It does not indicate how long you shall live. It is an indicator of your commitment to life, or in other words, your life force. He would have been a perfect member of my coven. Justin grasped my hand before I could think any more and pulled me onto the top rim of the boat. You scared to jump? He asked. I nodded. He gripped my hand even tighter. His warm palms, hot skin. My life had been so cold before now. My toes curled over the side of the boat, and I gripped Justin's hand. It's not like standing outside in the pouring rain or anything, he said, referring to our conversation in the meadow. But it's really fun, I promise. A promise from the boy who called me a whore. Justin sighed but kept his gaze on me. You gonna let me make this up to you or what? My jaw dropped. I had no response to that. I'm sorry, I said. You're right. Do you want flippers? He asked. I shook my head. Okay. Well, this water is pretty shallow. You can stand on your tiptoes, so don't dive. Just throw yourself in. Justin met my eyes and waited for me to look back from the water to him. You ready? I nodded. Gotta start somewhere, right? I looked at Justin's assuring glance. Right, I said. Justin's body propelled upward, so I closed my eyes, felt my knees bend, and I jumped into the air. The sun was on my back and I threw my hands up and slid into the ocean so it enveloped me. The water felt like 1,000 tons of prickly pressure sweeping over my body. All I could hear was the whoosh and hum of the water. My ears and nose filled with water, but I held my breath. Once I felt the sand squish beneath my toes, I shot up toward the surface, gasping for air. Once I broke the surface, I opened my eyes and laughed. After I wiped my eyes, I caught Justin's smile. Justin pushed through the chest-high water in my direction. Tracy was swimming toward him on his right, though his back was to her. He was smiling brightly and I was, too. He opened his mouth and for a moment, just a moment, it seemed that he had lifted his hand toward me. Then Tracy wrapped her arms around his chest and pressed herself to his back. She had on bright pink nail polish and like claws her fingers pressed onto his chest. Although Justin stopped reaching for me and instead held his hand over Tracy's, he never moved his gaze from me. Just when he turned to face Tracy, Tony popped up from the water and snapped a picture 2 inches away from my face. "So, Lena, where did you get that necklace?" Tracy asked from the passenger seat of Justin's SUV. She turned in her seat to look at me. We were on our way back to Wickham. It was late afternoon, sometime around 4, based on the placement of the sun. I placed the chain back around my neck. "It was a gift," I said. "It's so cute." "Pixie dust," Claudia said from the seat behind me. Tony scoffed. "That vial looks really beat up." "You should take it back and ask for a new one," Kate chimed in. I didn't say anything. We had turned onto Lovers Bay's Main Street. The section of Main Street closest to Wickham's campus was quite lively and filled with shops. That particular Saturday there was a farmer's market. I haven't seen anyone wear pixie dust necklaces since, like, 3rd grade. "How retro of you, Lena," Claudia said. We passed a section of vendors selling plants and flowers. One of the signs said wild herbs. "Can you let me out?" I asked. "You don't have to go," Kate said to me, but she threw a smirk to Tracy in the rearview mirror. "Yes. Please don't go," Tony said, but Justin was already slowing down. He pulled to the right side of the road. I could see the Wickham entrance gates just a few feet up from where we were. I stepped out of the car, catching a glimpse of Justin's eyes in the rearview mirror. "Talk to you later, Tony," I said, and slammed the door behind me. I was sure I would get a mouthful for leaving Tony with the vultures, but I had to do something. Something I should have done when I first got to Wickham. At the farmer's market I walked past carts of apples and pumpkins and various blends of apple cider. Finally, I stopped at the cart filled with herbs and wild flowers. Orange mums, purple pansies, asters, and bright yellow chrysanthemums lay in small wicker baskets. A brown satin ribbon held the stems together in a delicate bow. "Would you have any lavender?" I asked a woman sitting on a patio chair behind her cart. "A small bundle." The woman handed it to me with a smile. $4, she said. I paid and walked in the direction of campus. The lavender smelled heavenly, and I pressed it to my nose all the way from Main Street until the great arches of the Wickham campus. I walked through the gate, smiled to myself, and took a deep sigh. The campus was teeming with activity. Some people were lying out on blankets, others studied in groups, passing notebooks back and forth. I took a deep breath and listened to the voices echoing around me. "I can't read your handwriting. Just email me. Bio is going to kill me. I want that sweater Claudia Hawthorne was wearing. Here's to the soldier who bled." I nearly tripped over my own feet. I spun around to look behind me. "And the sailor who bravely did fa." I spun the other direction. Who was singing that song? A collection of girls on a blanket were reading from their textbooks. One of them had headphones over her ears. There were dozens of people on the pathway. 2 younger boys passed by me, but they were talking about the upcoming basketball season. I turned back around to look across the green, but no one was singing. I took a step and then another. Just when my steps were even enough and I was in jumping distance to Seeker, I heard it again. On the wings o' the year that's awa. I dropped the lavender onto the ground and held my hands over my ears. I could feel my heart thumping in my chest. I looked at the students around me again, just to make sure. Most of them were walking toward their dorms and enjoying the warm weather out on the green. I took my palms off my ears and bent down to pick up the lavender. Call me later. Dinner in 20. The conversations were normal. The Scottish man singing was gone. Ghosts have a way of misleading you, they can make your thoughts as heavy as branches after a storm. It was Viken's voice that swirled in the trees, haunting me from my memories. Even all the way in Lover's Bay, Massachusetts. I knew it, he missed me. Once I got to my door, I tacked the lavender right next to the rosemary. Lavender, if you are hunted, will protect you from evil forces. It will bless the house of the door it decorates. Chapter 13. Have you ever in your life wanted to do something terrible? I mean, earth-shattering terrible? Because that next morning, it took everything in my power not to call my coven. When I woke up, there was a silence. A hush to the room and to the world outside on Wickham campus. I focused on needless things. The ceiling in my bedroom was smooth and white. The birds chirped, and tree branches swayed from a light breeze. More than anything, I was aware that I was alone. No trip to the water could cure me. I yearned for songs, quiet musings, the way Viken would look at me from across a crowded room and I would know just what he was thinking. I missed the way the hills rolled away from my house and spread so far into the distance that during sunsets, just when it was safe enough to approach the windows, the grass looked like it was on fire. I gripped the soft sheets of my bed in my hands and rolled onto my side. Rhodes' words slivered through my mind. That final night we talked about so many things. One was a warning. You must not contact them, Lena. As much as you might want to. As much as the magic that you created yearns for them. Calls to them. You must deny yourself. I looked up at the telephone on the night table. Did they even have a telephone? If I called and one of them answered, would they know it was me? But I didn't call. Instead, I rolled to my other side, away from the telephone, and faced my bedroom windows. My thoughts drifted away from the coven. Maybe I would shower. As a vampire, I had no need to shower. There was nothing organic about me, I was magically sealed, inhuman, a dead body, enchanted by the blackest of magic. Now, in the human form, hot water rolling down my arms and back was the closest I came to finding some peace. I stepped out of the bed, away from the doorway, making sure not to allow my eyes to fall on Rhodes' sword just outside the bedroom door. I did that a lot for comfort, mostly. I rubbed sleep from my eyes and stepped onto the cool tiles of the bathroom floor. Ah! I screamed, and threw my back onto the wall behind me. The reflection in the mirror. My skin. It was a honey color. A deep bronze. The top of my nose had a sheen of glimmering gold across the bridge. I had tanned. I stepped within 2 inches of the mirror. I pulled my skin tight with the tips of my fingers. My eyes narrowed, I checked my cheeks, my chin, even my neck, for redness of the skin. Even with the 50 SPF I had gotten color, though I wasn't scorched as I had expected. I hadn't evaporated, either. I bounced out of the bathroom and hopped into the living room, though I stopped in the doorway. Rhodes' sword remained still on the wall, its plaque holding it frozen in place. Then I looked to the bureau and the photographs of my coven. They stared at me with a melancholy emptiness. But everything was empty, wasn't it? No one occupied the couch or the lounge seat. No one made the coffee or asked me what I wanted for breakfast. There was only me. I sat down on the couch. It was too early for breakfast, and Tony said he wouldn't be up and ready to eat until almost noon. Weekends were different at Wickham. The weekday students went home, and mostly everyone else took the time to study. The first week of classes had been uneventful except for anatomy class. I looked down at the coffee table. The book I took from the library was still open to Rhodes' engraving. I glanced at Rhodes' eyes, those beautiful eyes that would haunt me forever. They stared out at nothing. There was no one who could understand. Suddenly I was tired again, and I wanted nothing more than to curl up for a while. Yes, sleep would be nice, I thought. As I walked to my bedroom, I hoped that maybe I would dream of Rhodes. That night, I went by Tony's room to find that his family had come by to pick him up for dinner. So, I wandered the campus alone. Although it was warm for September, still in the 70s, I could smell something in the air. It was cooling off. Despite the twilight, Quartz dorm was full of activity. Boys passed footballs back and forth in the meadow, soccer balls, too. Rock music echoed from the art tower. Boys and girls walked along pathways and chatted near windows in various buildings. As I walked, two girls passed by me. I recognized one of them from English with Professor Lin. "Hi, Lena," she said. "Oh, hello," I replied, and found myself smiling. She was a junior, too. That was it. A hello just for me. I think I was heading for the beach to watch the stars when I noticed the greenhouse directly past the science buildings. With the scent of lavender still fresh from yesterday's purchase, I headed over another grassy patch toward the greenhouse. The building was made from glass and stretched back and away from the pathways. I pressed my palms on the glass panels and peered in, but it was dark inside. I focused on the various plants that were in my direct eye line. I gasped, and adrenaline dashed in my chest. Nasturtium. Roses, lilacs, marigold, and thyme, I whispered. All of the herbs I missed and so desired to have back in my life. The double-door entrance was glass just like the rest of the building, and I tugged on the black handles. The doors shuddered back at me. I wanted nothing more than to go inside. As a vampire, you would think I would be completely removed from the natural elements of the world. I could wield nothing natural myself. No need for breath or water, but I loved all herbs and flowers, plants. All flowers have a natural power. All stones have a natural power. Everything, the flowers, the plants, the soil, even the black magic that ran through me as a vampire, came from the earth. Greenhouse is closed. I spun around. Why don't you stop following me? Justin Enos was freshly showered and alone. He came from the grassy patch between Quartz Meadow and the science buildings. He was wearing a blue button-down and khaki shorts. He looked like he was glistening. "I'm walking to the parking lot," he said, and pointed up the pathway. "Why do you want to go in the greenhouse?" He stepped next to me and looked into the darkened building. It smells like dirt in there. I love it, I said with an edge of a whisper. Do you? He gave me a surprised glance. I looked back into the greenhouse and didn't answer. I didn't want to explain my love for flowers and herbs. Still mad at me, he said. One snorkeling trip and I'm supposed to swoon. I replied. He leaned a hand on the greenhouse and leaned forward almost inches from my face. You smell amazing, he said. Thank you, I said with a flush of breath in my voice. Justin's eyes pulsated into mine, and then he pulled back to an appropriate distance. If I didn't know any better I would have thought he was testing me, as vampires do, through a locked gaze. Still gotta do something about you, don't I? He said, almost growling. It made me want to purr, if it was possible. Justin, called a voice. Both of us spun around. Tracy and the three-piece headed toward the greenhouse, coming from the direction of the Union. All three were dressed in black, short cocktail dresses, though each one was just slightly different in style from the others. Hi, Lena, Tracy said when she got to the pathway. You tanned so fast, Claudia said to me. I looked down at my arms. I guess I didn't notice, I replied with a shrug. Staying in tonight? Tracy asked, looping her arm through Justin's. I looked into Tracy's eyes as a vampire would. A stare that pierced deep into the pupils. Though I saw no depth to her soul. She was flat, a child of the secular universe. In fact, every one of the three-piece was a victim of her own self-absorption. Justin on the other hand had a light in his eyes. A window of sorts, where I could see that he was much, much more than an average boy. He had stealth and courage like Road. He had soul. I tore my eyes away from Tracy's. There was a tug in my chest as though a spell had been broken. Yes, I'm staying in, I said, and refocused on Claudia and Kate. Sunday isn't a big night out for me. Just hanging out outside the greenhouse? Kate asked. She was in an extremely short dress. Too bad, Tracy said to me, and then looked at Justin. Let's go, I want to get to the club and back before curfew. And with that, they started walking up the path. I didn't want to follow behind, so I pretended I was looking at something in the greenhouse. Night, Justin said with a glance back at me. Night, I said, and soon they were enveloped in the blackness of the path and I was walking home. 9 a.m. Monday morning, and I found Tony at the library. Turns out he had been there for hours. He was surrounded by hundreds of pictures. I mean it, hundreds of pictures of me. After I put my backpack behind the desk, I looked down the long aisle of books toward the back study area. I took off my sunglasses and started down the row of books toward Tony. I stood above the table, but Tony didn't look up. The pictures were from the snorkeling trip. There must have been 200 photos, each from a different perspective. Tony's head was down, and his fingers tightly clenched a stumpy piece of charcoal. I looked at a white sketch pad on the table and saw the outline of a pair of eyes that looked very much like my own. You realize this could be categorized as an obsession? I said with my arms crossed over each other. Tony shot back into his chair and I have to admit I took a step back out of surprise. His usual happy-go-lucky attitude was nowhere to be seen. His smooth skin had a few lines of charcoal on it and a black smudge on his forehead where he must have been resting his palm while working. "I've never done a portrait like this before," he said, and then bent over, back at the sketchbook. "I gotta get the perspective right," he grumbled, though it seemed Tony was talking more to himself. He looked at me, back down at the sketch pad, and ripped the page out of the notebook. He crumpled it into a ball and dropped it to the floor. I slid one of the photos from off the table. In it, Justin Enos and I stood on the rim of the boat. Justin's hand was in mine, and the way our profiles looked, it was as though we were washed in sunlight. I was looking into Justin's eyes and I was smiling. The water directly below us cast a glittery, gold glow on our faces. Before I had a moment longer to look at the curve of my mouth and whiteness of my teeth, Tony snatched the photo out of my hand and threw it carelessly into the pile. "Hey!" I protested. "Wrong. The perspectives on these are all wrong." "Tony, how could that be? Look how many there are. I'm sure you can find." He shook his head quickly and with one sweep of his arm pushed the photos into a canvas bag and stalked away up the long aisle and toward the front door. His backpack fell off his arm and dangled over his wrist. He brought it back over his shoulder just as his baggy pants slid off his backside, showing me his boxer shorts and the top of a very small butt crack. He took a small hop library door. "Tony, wait!" I called, and pushed out of the library. I tried to hold in the laughter as I jogged to catch up. "You don't get it, Lena," he said to me, but he kept walking. "I have to get this right. I mean, it's not just your portrait. It's a big part of my scholarship. Every project I choose has to have some kind of learning curve. You know, where I'm applying something new to my work. So painting a portrait of me has to push the envelope in terms of your artistic ability." I asked. Our gazes met, and Tony's frustration eased into a smile. He rested his arm over my shoulder. "When you put it that way and talk so fancy, yet. Also, you're easy on the eyes." We started walking toward anatomy class, but there was foot traffic. Students gathered together in a large group, so we had to walk slowly. "The prince and princess are having a fight," said a junior in front of Tony and me. I did not know her, but she had poor blood flow, dull blue veins. That color was always a clear indication. Tracy and Justin were on the meadow in front of Quartz. Tracy was pointing at Justin so that one French manicured nail was inches from his nose. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked at the ground. As we turned left toward the Madame Curie statue, I caught only a snippet of the fight. "You're always suggesting the library these days." "Let me guess, Justin, to see the one girl on campus who doesn't throw herself at you." "Tracy. That's not it. She's really rich. I assume that has something to do with it." "Sorry, not everyone can buy their way into a private apartment, Justin. I know you have a single, but roommates are, like, part of the deal here." "What are you even talking about? You never want to come to my room anymore. And don't try to deny it. You think she's pretty. I've seen the way you look at her in English class." "Whoa," Tony whispered as we walked into the science building for anatomy. I couldn't help feel a burn of satisfaction. During class, my thoughts jumped back and forth between Justin and Tracy's fight and Viken's voice echoing through the campus. After obsessing over Tracy's accusations about Justin's feelings for me, I would revert back to thoughts about Viken. How and why did I hear him so clearly? I knew I wasn't crazy and hearing voices. A vampire in love can communicate with his mate telepathically, though Viken's connection should have been severed with my transformation. Viken's willpower and determination when he was alive were powerful forces, they were part of the reason I changed him into a vampire. These aspects of his personality would have exaggerated as the years went on. Perhaps he could have reached me even though I was thousands of miles away. "Sit," Tony said after anatomy class. He interrupted my thoughts by the sharp sound of wood dragging across wood. He slid a stool from one side of the art tower to the other. After a few moments, I was sitting on the stool while Tony worked away. He abandoned the charcoals, deciding he couldn't grasp my features well with it. He came from behind the easel and bent forward, close to my face. He took a pinky finger, decorated by a silver band, and moved a strand of hair out of my eyes. He checked the accuracy of a paint color by dabbing it on his palm. "You look great. This is gonna be perfect," he said with a smile. I liked the smell of paint in the room and the fresh grass outside wafting with the breeze through the open windows. Tony smelled a little like a boy, musky but covered in paint. I looked into Tony's eyes. He stared into mine. A smile crept across his face. Soon, before I knew it, I was lifting my chin toward his, and our lips were inches apart. Then someone knocked on the doorway frame. "Lena." Tony jumped backward. He spun around to the doorway. Justin walked into the art studio. I smiled, completely unable to help it. "I went to the library to look for you," Justin said, striding across the floor toward me. "First the greenhouse, now this." "The librarian said you're usually up here with Tony." "Just for work," I said, and stood up. Tony was already putting his paints away. I was smiling so much I felt giddy. "Are you painting Lena?" Justin asked, and craned his neck to peek at the easel. "Yeah," Tony said curtly, and gathered his paintbrushes in his hands. "Cool. Can I see?" Tony picked up the canvas. "No. Totally not even ready yet." He moved the easel so it faced the wall. "He's a little sensitive," I said, still smiling. "What's up, Enos?" Tony said. "You don't usually come up here." "I'm here to see how brave you are," Justin said, but he was talking to me. "Brave?" I asked, turning to face Justin more directly. "Saturday. We're going bungee jumping." I looked from Justin to Tony. Tony shook his head quickly. "Don't do it, Lena. It's suicide." "What's bungee jumping?" I asked. "Seriously?" Justin asked, and now leaned against a studio desk. He crossed one ankle over the other. A pose I had seen him do before. This was a comfort position, a way he stood so that he would feel as though he was in a position of power. I sighed. This ability to read positions was a vampire trait. A habit that thus far I could not turn off. "You jump from a bridge to a lake. It's fun." Tony stepped between us and put both hands up. One hand was still gripping all of his brushes. "You wear a strap around your ankle." It's a really elastic cord and then you jump from a high bridge or a building. It'll be worth it, Justin interrupted. Tony placed his paintbrushes in a water basin inside the art tower sink. He washed off his paint palette and turned. To who, Enos? Just because you have a death wish doesn't mean Lena does, Tony said. All right, I said. I'll go. Justin's face lit up immediately. But only if Tony goes. No. Nope. No way, Tony said. No, he repeated with a kind of maniacal laughter. He stood in front of some of the student cubbies and pushed a red curtain aside. The curtain sectioned off Tony's art cubby. All the art students had them. He threw his palette into a metal bin. No, he said, laughing again and shaking his head. He threw his black leather portfolio book under his arm and blasted past Justin and me. No, he said, stepping into the stairwell. No. Ha. Ha. I mean, no. He continued saying it all the way down the stairwell. That night, I came home and collapsed onto the lounge chair. My eyes rested on the bureau across the room and I stared at the photo of my coven. My body just couldn't run for endless hours anymore. There were blood and muscles now and my ever-present thumping heart. It was so quiet. My eyes grew heavy. Outside, it was silent, but every once in a while I could hear chatter from people walking in the stairwell of my dorm. I listened to my breathing because it actually mattered if I had oxygen in my lungs. In and out. In and out, the rhythmic whoosh of the air was comforting. My eyelids slid down for the 100th time and finally, I let them fall. Then, there, in my mind, coming out of the blackness, was the first-floor sitting parlor of my home in Hathersage, though it looked dramatically different. 100 years ago there were large oriental rugs, deep red curtains, furniture upholstered in plush velvet. In this dream, the room remained the same but accessories had been added, like flat-screen televisions and computers. In the corner, Vicken, dressed in a pair of black dress pants and a black button-down shirt, paced back and forth. He walked to the window and pressed a button on the right side of the wall. The shades mechanically rose. Outside, directly below the window, was the cemetery washed in a blood-orange glow. On a tombstone was my name, Lena Bodanti. Something is amiss, Vicken said, though he spoke in Hebrew. Rhodes' materials are gone. His bedroom stripped. She will rise, Gavin said, speaking in French from the doorway. Patience. Vicken did not turn to look at him. Their speech was a mishmash of languages, cultures, and accents. We've gone over this, Heath said, joining Gavin in the doorway and of course only speaking in Latin. Yes, but every day as we come closer to Newt Rouge, there is a rising doubt in my mind, Vicken explained. Fear, Song said, slipping past Gavin and Heath and sitting down in a brown leather lounger that faced the window. He spoke in English. Vicken scoffed. Fear is what holds you to that window, Song said. Vicken's fingers dug into the window frame. His nails cut a line of ridges in the wood. He turned from the window rapidly and collapsed into an empty armchair. On an end table was a dish filled with dried lilac. He picked them up by the tips of his fingers and let the purple petals fall like grains of sand back into the bowl. I need her. If in 5 weeks she does not rise, I will dig her up with my bare hands, he said, and that's when I opened my eyes in the living room, gasping for breath and smelling lilac in my hair. Chapter 14. Nickerson Summit is a bridge suspended 150 feet over a river. That Saturday we left in Justin's SUV for Cape Cod Bungee, which was only half an hour from Wickham. Most people had to get parental consent to bungee jump. I just forged Rhodes' signature. After an hour tutorial and a bunch of papers in which we signed that if we died our parents wouldn't sue, we took our lives into our own hands. We lined up to bungee off Nickerson Summit. I can't believe you talked me into this. Such a bad idea, Tony said, pacing back and forth in front of the bridge. He stopped every few paces and shook his shoulders. You can do this, he mumbled under his breath. Are you gonna jump with me? Tracy asked Justin while hanging all over him. We're all gonna jump alone, babe, Justin said. Tracy leaned in for a kiss. I noticed that her mouth was open and that Justin kept his closed. It was an odd sort of kiss, not equal. I want to go first. Tracy squealed and hugged each member of the three-piece. Thank God, Tony said under his breath, and sat down on the curb of the bridge. Promise you'll jump right after me? Tracy asked Justin. Her eyes took a stab at me, then she kissed Justin on the cheek. Sure, he said, and Tracy took her position on the bridge. Tracy stood at the ledge of the bridge, held both arms out, and then leaned forward. She shrieked and then she was gone. All of us ran to the ledge of the bridge. The ends of Tracy's hair just barely touched the river. She held her arms above her head, and her body flowed with the movements of the cord. She rose up, almost back up to the height of the bridge, and then back down. The way her body was so limp, I could tell she completely trusted the technology. How on earth would I do that? As the cord started to slow, she soared through the air more languidly, side to side, so her hair swayed and flew in the wind. As the bungee company people came in their dinghy to untie her from the bungee cord, Claudia and Kate grasped hands and jumped next. They shrieked the entire way down. Followed by Curtis, then Roy. Soon, the only people left to bungee were Justin, Tony, and me. Come on, Tony, you can do it. Tracy yelled from the river's edge. I peered over the edge, surprised that Tracy actually said something nice to Tony. When I looked, I saw that the girls were sunbathing. Underneath their clothes they were wearing matching red bikinis. All I had was my bra and underwear. Tony stepped up to the bridge. He clenched and unclenched his hands. My hands are sweating. My back is sweating. I'm nasty. He turned and tossed me his baseball hat. I can't believe I'm doing this. I wanna puke. The bungee guy, standing next to Tony, handed a blue bucket to him out of nowhere. Tony took a deep breath. I am an artist. I can do this. Are you ready, yet? The bungee guy snarled. He was squat with a beard and a t-shirt that read, "Fat guys love meat." Nice shirt, Tony said to the bungee guy and then looked back at me. I can hear my mother, Len. Tony, why you wanna kill yourself? I laughed so hard my chest hurt. Tony placed his arms out at his side, closed his eyes, and screamed so that his voice cracked the entire way down. I heard a splash and then the three-piece hooped and cheered. Justin and I were the only ones left. The bungee man snapped and tied me into the harness. Behind me, on the ground, I could feel Justin watching me. "You did this on purpose," I said to Justin as the man continued to strap me in. "Maybe," he said. "What is it you're playing at? Your girlfriend is down there at the river. Let's jump together. Come on, Lena," Tony called from below. "If you jump with me, Tracy will know." Justin stood up. "Know what?" "I mean, she'll think you did it on purpose." "I did do it on purpose," he said. "You too," the bungee man said. "Keep your eyes open if you're jumping together. Don't bash heads or anything. I hate cleaning up blood." "If you jump with me," I started to say. "I don't care anymore." Justin grasped my hand into his, and we stepped onto the bridge ledge. I didn't look at Tracy and the three-piece because they were utterly silent below. Justin had waited to jump with me and now everyone knew it. I saw him lift his right foot. "No, wait," I said, feeling the enormity of the distance from the bridge to the river. Then Justin squeezed my hand, and I refocused on the river below. The way the little waves swept together and moved. I watched the curl of the whitecaps from the dinghy's motors. It came into my mind at that moment, the dream of the coven. It wasn't real, though it had felt real. I suddenly imagined Rhodes' enraged face. He sacrificed his life for me and I was going to throw myself off a bridge? "I feel like you've never gone outside your house," Justin said, and he broke the spell of my thoughts. With my hand grasped in his, I looked at him. "That's how you're looking at the river?" "I'm not sure I did before now," I said. "You can't hide under a boat cabin for the rest of your life." "Right." I looked down at Tony, who pumped his fist in the air. "You gotta let go," Justin said. I looked back at Justin and pushed the image of the coven out of my mind. I was ready. With my right hand in his left, we both broke into the smallest of smiles. "Ready?" he asked. We jumped. My body was free. My hands broke with Justin's when we jumped. I felt my torso rising and falling, and the air rushed by my ears and between my fingers. Through all the cheers it was Tony's I could hear the clearest. My hips were pulled by the elastic bungee up and then down. The wind rushed over my cheeks and over my scalp. I looked to my right and saw that Justin's eyes were closed, his arms above his head. I mimicked him by closing my eyes and a chill rushed over me. I smiled, unable to help it. When the elasticity of the bungee slowed, I looked over at Justin, upside down. He was smiling at me. "Sad anymore?" he asked. As they helped us into the boats and drove us to the riverbank, Justin wouldn't break my gaze. No, in that moment, sadness was not possible. Chapter 15. Lena. "Wait!" Tony called from the top of the art tower stairs. It was the day after our bungee excursion and Tony had spent the morning sketching my eyes. When he came into the doorway, there was a green streak of paint across his nose. "Thanks for today," he said. "I finally got it, I think." "Anytime," I said. Before I got to the bottom of the stairs I heard Tony say to the other students in the tower, "Ladies, don't let my cheeks stride distract you. I'll be here all day. You have paint on your nose, Tony," someone said, and a slew of giggles erupted from the art tower. I stepped outside and looked up. The clouds were deep, layer upon layer of grey swollen puffs. As I walked across the meadow, I was surprised to see Curtis, Roy, Claudia, and Kate sitting on a blanket. As I walked past, ready to smile at the girls, Kate leaned to Claudia and hid her mouth with her hand. Over the tops of Kate's manicured fingers, Claudia's eyes gazed into mine. Claudia cocked her head to the side, listening to Kate, but instead of smiling and sharing some devious secret as they usually did, Claudia's eyes softened. I looked back to Kate, her eyebrows narrowed, and though I could not see her mouth, I was sure she was sneering. Claudia, though, there seemed to be a shift. Claudia and I shared this moment until Curtis leaned back on his elbows and looked me up and down. He smirked. He was tall like Justin but fuller, with a pouting mouth and a double chin. I walked slowly. Kate tossed her blonde hair over her shoulder. Roy, Claudia's boyfriend, stared at me too. He was smaller than both Justin and Curtis. "Nice jump yesterday?" Curtis asked. Kate scoffed. Then it hit me, a slap so hard that it burned my cheeks. I had no extrasensory perception. I couldn't access how they felt. I knew disdain was oozing from Kate, but that was obvious. I concentrated on the group, but no sensation came over me. No clear idea of their emotional intentions. It was gone. I looked away swiftly and quickened my step. I looked down at the blades of grass and the wings of a passing fly. Okay, my vampire sight was still there. I sighed in relief. I headed over the meadow toward the science buildings. Thump thump. Thump thump. Thump thump thump. Stupid heart. The beating fluttered in my ears, making them throb. Adrenaline rushed up and down my chest so that my fingertips tingled. I walked faster, past students headed toward their classes. I hid my eyes from anyone coming my way. It was very hard to breathe. I brought my hand to my chest and felt the shudder of my lungs. My body was rebelling against me. This physical reaction, what was this? Anxiety? Fear? I gritted my teeth. I was going to go to the greenhouse for some control. I almost walked by the archway to Quartz, intending to pass by without stopping, when I heard a very familiar voice. I knew it. I knew this would happen, Tracy said. Knew what? This has been a long time coming, Trace. Long time? Like a few weeks, right? Since you met her. Everything was fine before Lena Bodanti came to school. I gasped and rested my back against the stone of the building. My heart was still thumping like crazy. My ESP. Why, when I really needed it, was it gone so completely? And without warning? It's not Lena, Justin tried to explain. I refocused on the conversation. Tracy scoffed. Come on. The minute that girl opened her mouth, I knew you wanted her. Lena this, Lena that. The whole damsel in distress crap. Who's never been on a boat? Who hates sunlight? I snuck forward so I was just to the left of the archway. The looks from Claudia, Kate, and Curtis made sense now. They must have known this was going to happen. I just don't get it. Tracy's voice broke, and I could tell she was going to cry. I peeked around the corner of the building and saw Justin and Tracy in the shadow of the alleyway. The glass doors of the dorm opened and closed when students walked past. Most kept their heads down while whispering quietly to one another. Justin drew her close, which made my stomach burn. "What about me?" she cried. "I saw you up on Nickerson Bridge. You didn't want to bungee with me. It's just different now. I feel different." Tracy's head snapped up, and her eyes landed on me. I whipped around so my back rested against the building. "Lena!" Tracy squealed. I groaned. "What?" Justin said. "Lena. She's at the top of the alleyway. What is wrong with the both of you?" Tracy said. The sound of her heels on the pavement clicked up and past me. She ran fast, through the meadow, and was on a pathway before I noticed that Justin was standing next to me. I wanted to follow Tracy and tell her how sorry I was. I had a tingle in my stomach, a squirming feeling, and then Justin's fingers touched my shoulder. I stepped away from him into the meadow. "Lena," Justin's eyes burned with desire to comfort me. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," I said. "You didn't." He reached out to me. I wanted him to wrap his hands around my back and hold me close, but everything felt heavy in my chest. I pointed where Tracy ran off into the campus green. "Just now, I did." "No, that was me." I stepped deeper into the grass. Through the sporadic drops of rain falling in front of me, Justin and I held each other's gazes. How could one set of eyes show me so much? Justin's passion for me and his connection with my heart allowed me to see far into his soul. Through the green of his eyes, deep into the pupils, there was an entryway, a place where I could see and then feel all of Justin's intentions. I gasped and hoped, no matter what happened to my vampire side as I became more human, that I would never lose that connection to him. "Please," I thought. "Please never let me forget how he makes me feel." I had to look somewhere else, so I focused on Justin's mouth. His lips were set in a straight line. I would have given anything to stop the guilt running through my veins. To stop all the world and time moving with it and kiss him right there in the middle of the campus. But that was my curse, wasn't it? To always know the feeling of guilt and know it was my fault. As though I was ripping myself away, I turned and took off for the greenhouse. Pit-pat. Pit-pat. The greenhouse was quiet except for the rain starting to pepper the curved glass ceiling. It had been hot before the rain shower, so the windows were covered in fog. Above me, dozens of potted, purple ferns were suspended from metal hooks. The leaves were green with a lavender fringe. I walked underneath them down the main aisle of the greenhouse. On either side of me, 12-foot-high shelves lined the walls. The misting mechanisms came on every few minutes, keeping the plants watered and warm. For the first time in a very long while, I felt safe. I knew the magic of my ESP faded while bungee jumping. When we were standing on that bridge and his hand was grasped around mine, I abandoned my fear of the coven in that moment and chose to participate in the real world. Another sacrifice. Road was right, it is always the intent that matters. These thoughts came sifting in and out of my mind as I was walking. Viken's face came to my head, and because of the fear that came with it, I reached for some rosebuds. "Rose in your tea will bring you love." I stuck the petals in my pocket. Next, I would look for apple blossoms for luck. Hanging and growing around me were cacti, orchids, ferns, green, leafy plants all growing in standard green pots. Some leaves were big and stretched over into the aisle while others were small and barely visible to the eye, the non-vampire eye, that is. It smelled like wet earth. Yet, it was no longer something I envied. Perhaps for once in a very long history, I understood that I came from that dirt. I was natural, too. You glad you jumped? I spun around. Justin stood in the greenhouse doorway. The double doors eased to a close behind him and we were alone. I turned around to face forward. I didn't move. He walked toward me and his sneakers made a slight squish on the wet greenhouse floor. Then he was so close his chest rested on my back. Justin's body was strong and sculpted, so different from a vampire's, which remains in the exact state at the moment of death. Justin took slow breaths that sent shivers down the back of my neck. Goosebumps swept over my back and shoulders. I looked right to see an orange flower, with puffy petals. Some had a blood orange hue, others were bright yellow. The petals were full with a slightly jagged edge, so the lot of them made them seem like a plush seat. Calendula, I said, feeling the heat of Justin's body against mine. More commonly known as marigold, I barely whispered, short of breath. Justin reached a hand around my stomach and pulled me toward him. I was so close, I leaned my head back onto his chest. Unbelievable curative properties. Good for bites, I continued. He didn't say anything. He just held me close and wrapped both hands around my waist. My body tingled, my hands and fingertips alive. I stepped forward, took a breath in, and then in again, finally exhaling out. I walked slowly, so Justin walked behind me. Another flower caught my eye on the shelf to my right. I turned slowly all the way around and met Justin's eyes. I looked down at the flowers that were directly below his fingertips. Nasturtium, I said, and reached down. I plucked a dainty yellow flower bud from a long green stem. There was no more room between us. This was as close as we could get. I held the tiny flower up to him in the palm of my hand. You can eat it. Justin looked down at the flower and then at me. He opened his mouth, waiting. I placed the flower on his tongue and he closed his lips. I brought my face closer to his without even thinking of the consequences. He swallowed the petals and I watched his Adam's apple rise and fall. Soon his hands were on my hips and my face was tilted up toward his. What does that one mean? He whispered. Our mouths were millimeters apart. Happiness. Right where you are. A human kiss. A mouth hot with the peppery taste of nasturtium. He was leading my lips open and closed, the pressure of his lips against mine. I had never been kissed before. Not like this. Not like I was alive. There were petals, saliva, breath, and pressure. Heartbeats and my eyes closed. Justin's hands pressed onto my hips, slowly traveled up my back, and threaded into my hair. I can't tell you how long we kissed like that. I know that when I finally stepped back, Justin moaned, just a bit. I heard footsteps, one slightly heavier than the other. A sound that only I would be keen enough to understand. A shoe that was just microscopically different in construction from the other. I peeked over Justin's right shoulder and met Tony's eyes. He blinked once, turned away, and stalked back toward the lacrosse field in the direction of Hopper. A raindrop rolled down my arm, over my wrist, down a knuckle, and then dripped off my finger onto the floor. I stood in the doorway of my apartment for a good 5 minutes before I stopped replaying the kiss over and over in my mind. I was soaked so deeply that my clothes clung to my body. I giggled, bringing my hand to my mouth, surprised by the way it sounded, and the blood rushed to my cheeks. Justin Enos had kissed me. I looked up, not meaning to, but my eyes fell on Rhodes' sword. I walked slowly, step by step, until I was so close to the sword that I could lick it. I watched my smile fade in the reflection of the metal. Even now, I could see tiny blood stains ingrained into the metal. I reached for the vile necklace, considering a moment if perhaps I needed Rhodes' remains around my neck. I dropped my hands and turned to head into my bedroom. Of course I did. Justin Enos may have kissed me, but I wasn't ready to let go of my past. I was still comforted by the memories of my life dealing out destruction and death. As I walked away, I considered what it would mean to take down that sword and put it away, place it in a trunk to remain in the dark with all the rest of my old intentions. No. I wasn't ready. Though, it was time to do something. Even if it was something small. The rest of the audiobook will be continued in the next episode. Join us on Patreon for early access or more great audiobooks. A link is provided in the video description.